Picture this, it's 1932 in Western Australia. The sun's beating down, farmers are tending their crops, all seems peaceful. But wait, what's that on the horizon? It's not a dust storm, it's not a mirage, it's emus, thousands of them, marching like feathery soldiers towards the wheat fields. Who would have thought these flightless birds would become Australia's most formidable foe? These big birds, standing up to 6 feet tall and weighing up to 130 pounds, were about to give the Australian military a run for their money. The farmers were in a tizzy. Their crops were being decimated by these feathered fiends. They called for help. The government scratched their heads. What to do? Send in the Navy? Nah, emus don't swim. The Air Force? Don't be silly, emus can't fly. The Army? Bingo. Let's send in the big guns to tackle these big birds. And so began the Great Emu War of 1932, a battle that would go down in history as Australia's funniest defeat. Now, you might be wondering how on earth emus became such a problem in the first place. Well, it all started with a bit of an emu baby boom. These feathered troublemakers had been happily living in the Australian outback for millennia. But then, in the aftermath of World War I, the Australian government had a brilliant idea. They decided to turn ex-soldiers into farmers and sent them to cultivate the marginal areas of Western Australia. At first, everything seemed hunky-dory. The farmers planted their wheat, the sun shone, and all was right with the world. But then came the Great Depression. Wheat prices plummeted faster than a skydiver without a parachute. The farmers were told to grow even more wheat to make up for the low prices. More wheat fields meant more food for our feathered friends. It was like rolling out an all-you-can-eat buffet for emus. And boy, did they come to feast. To make matters worse, 1932 brought unusually heavy rainfall. All that rain had created perfect breeding conditions for emus. The emu population exploded faster than a firecracker on New Year's Eve. Suddenly, the farmers found themselves facing an invasion of epic proportions. We're talking about 20,000 emus marching across the landscape like feathery locusts. These birds weren't just nibbling at the edges of fields, they were charging right in, trampling crops, poking holes in fences, and generally causing chaos. Enter Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery. The farmers had called for help, and by golly, they were going to get it. Major Meredith was given his marching orders. Take 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. His mission, to wage war on the emus. The military's plan was simple. They would drive out to where the emus were gathered, set up their guns and mow them down. Easy peasy, right? Wrong. You see, emus might look a bit goofy, but they're surprisingly clever and fast and tough. It's like they're wearing little feathery suits of armor. The soldiers were about to find out that fighting emus was like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
On November 2nd, 1932, Operation Feather Duster, okay, that wasn't its real name, but it should have been, kicked off. The soldiers spotted a mob of about 50 emus and prepared to open fire. But these weren't your average docile farm birds. As soon as the guns started blazing, they split up and ran in all directions. It was like trying to shoot confetti out of the air.
To make matters worse, the Lewis guns kept jamming. By the end of the day, only a handful of emus had fallen. Meanwhile, thousands more were probably off somewhere having a good laugh at the humans' expense. Major Meredith and his men retreated to lick their wounds and come up with a new strategy. Now, you might think that after their initial failure, the military would reconsider their tactics. Maybe come up with a cunning plan, perhaps even admit defeat and go home. But no, they were determined to win this war against the feathered menace. The soldiers tried everything. They set up ambushes only to have the emus run right past them. They attempted to herd the birds into a kill zone, but the emus scattered like leaves in the wind. At one point, they even tried mounting one of the Lewis guns on a truck. Picture it, a military vehicle bouncing across the outback, chasing after birds that can run at 31 miles per hour. It was like a scene from a slapstick comedy.
But the emus had a few tricks up there. Well, they don't have sleeves, but you get the idea. These crafty birds seem to have an uncanny ability to sense danger. They'd post lookouts who would warn the flock when the soldiers approached.
The soldiers' frustration grew with each passing day. They'd fire hundreds of rounds, only to bring down a handful of birds. As the days wore on, the military's tactics became increasingly desperate.
At one point, someone had the bright idea to try and lure the emus with wheat baits.
Unsurprisingly, the emus weren't fooled. They probably took one look at the bait and thought, nice try, humans.
Then there was the brilliant plan to have local farmers herd the emus into range of the guns. Picture a group of grizzled Australian farmers trying to shepherd thousands of uncooperative birds.
It was like trying to herd cats if cats were 6 feet tall and had a vendetta against wheat. The emus naturally found this all very amusing and decided to run in every direction except the one the farmers wanted.
In a moment of true desperation, someone suggested using tear gas on the emus.
Thankfully, this idea was quickly shot down.
By this point, the soldiers were starting to wonder if they were starring in some sort of cosmic joke.
Instead, they found themselves outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly embarrassed by creatures with brains the size of walnuts. As the Great Emu War dragged on, the tally of defeat became increasingly embarrassing for the human side. The official reports read like a comedy script. In the first week alone, 2,500 rounds of ammunition were fired. The result? A grand total of about 50 emus. That's right, folks. It took 50 bullets to bring down one emu. At this rate, they'd need a small country's entire ammunition supply to deal with the estimated 20,000 emus.
Yeah, well, we did manage to kill 986 emus, and 2,500 more died from their injuries.
Meanwhile, the emus were probably off somewhere, counting coup and awarding medals to each other. And this Purple Heart goes to Steve for his brave run through machine gun fire to reach that particularly juicy wheat stalk. The government, realizing that this war was becoming a national embarrassment, decided to call it quits after about a month. They withdrew the military and left the farmers to deal with the emu problem on their own. The emus had won, and they didn't even know they were fighting a war. In the end, the score stood at something like this. Emus, thousands still happily munching on wheat. Humans, a few hundred dead birds, several thousand wasted rounds of ammunition, and a whole lot of wounded pride. Now, you might think that losing a war to a bunch of overgrown chickens would be a source of national shame. But this is Australia we're talking about, the land where everything tries to kill you and you learn to laugh about it. The public reaction to the Great Emu War was less, oh, the shame, and more, did you hear the one about the soldier and the emu? Aussie humour, known for its dry wit and self-deprecation, had a field day with this one. Cartoonists across the country sharpened their pencils and got to work. Newspapers were filled with images of emus outsmarting bumbling soldiers. One particularly popular cartoon showed an emu sitting in a general's chair, planning military strategy. Because let's face it, the emus seemed to be better at it than the actual military. The jokes came thick and fast. Heard about the new military tactic? They're going to dress up as ears of wheat to lure the emus in. Or how about this one? Why did the emu cross the road? To give the soldiers something to shoot at. As news of the Great Emu War spread, the media had a field day. Newspapers across Australia and even internationally couldn't resist the story. I mean, come on, it's not every day you get to write headlines like "Army loses to birds" or "Feathered foes foil military." Editors must have been rubbing their hands with glee. It was the kind of story that writes itself.
International papers picked up on the story too. The Emu War made Australia the butt of jokes worldwide. One can only imagine the glee of British journalists, finally able to poke fun at their former colony. American papers probably had a hard time believing it wasn't a joke. Australia deploys military against birds sounds more like a headline from The Onion than actual news.
Some clever journalist dubbed it the Emu War, and the name stuck. It was perfect. It had just the right balance of absurdity and officialdom. Plus it's catchy. Try saying it without smiling. Now, you might think that the Great Emu War was just a hilarious blip in history with no real lessons. But you'd be wrong. This feathery fiasco actually taught us quite a bit.
For starters, it proved that nature always finds a way. No matter how advanced our technology, a bunch of birds with walnut-sized brains can still outsmart us.
The Emu War also showed the importance of knowing your enemy. The military went in thinking they were dealing with big, dumb birds. Instead, they found themselves up against fast, clever, and surprisingly bullet-resistant foes. It's a lesson that applies well beyond bird battles. Always respect your opponent, even if they have feathers and a silly walk.
Perhaps the most important lesson was about the limits of military might. All the guns and soldiers in the world couldn't solve a problem that was essentially ecological.